as they figure out the Zoom can come in at their convenience. First off, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, the panelists, the audience from across British Columbia. There's, I noticed down here, some people from quite far reaches of our province. I'd like to acknowledge as we begin that I am in the legislature, my legislative office, which is on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And we are very grateful to be present here on the traditional territory to have this panel. I will note that panelists are distributed around Greater Victoria, and the members of the audience are not exclusive to this area, but across British Columbia. I'm really pleased that earlier today, the government made an announcement with respect to means and ways that the British Columbians can participate in providing information in a post-COVID recovery strategy for government. And I'm even more pleased that Minister George Heyman, the Honourable George Heyman, Minister of Environment, has agreed to tell us a little bit at the beginning of this town hall about what government's intentions are. And I thought it would be provide an excellent opportunity to set the stage for our town hall to ask Minister Heyman, who kindly agreed to say a few words about government's direction at the beginning. So thank you, Minister Heyman, for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Andrew, for inviting me to this opportunity to speak with people who are tuning in. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples. We've been through a lot in the last 3 months together, and I think COVID has shown us that we do better, even under times of great stress when we're working together, whether it's observing social distancing or the tremendous respect that people are showing at 7 o'clock every night to the essential workers, healthcare workers, transit workers, food retail workers, all the people who are helping us get through our lives in this difficult time. And one of the things I've learned in government as well, it was such an honor to have a chance to work with Andrew Weaver on developing our climate plan as a government, our Clean BC plan. And it taught me that we always have things to learn from each other, and we always have things that we can do better when we take all perspectives into account and bring the best of our thinking and the best of our experience together. Since March, we as a government have been thinking about what can we do once we get through the health crisis to deal with the economic crisis that are facing so many individuals and families. And you'll know that $1.5 billion were set aside to deal with economic recovery. We've been spending a lot of money on supports for people, a lot of money on healthcare, but we have not yet decided how we are going to spend the money on economic recovery. But since March, there have been over 1,500 outreach meetings, over 20,000 people have been spoken to. I've been in a number of meetings with the Premier, the Finance Minister, and groups of people like our Climate Solutions Council or a group of environmental groups. Others have been talking to small business, others have been talking to nonprofit organizations, Indigenous people, and industry. We've been getting ideas, but as Cabinet, when we've been meeting for the last while, we decided we really needed a framework to make decisions about what kinds of both shovel-ready and shovel-worthy projects we would invest in to put people back to work. We have to bring our values to that. So I'm going to briefly touch on, at a very high level, what those values are. We know that young people, that women, that new Canadians, that Indigenous people who work in food services, retail, and the hospitality sector have been the hardest hit. And many of them are unemployed, and we need to take steps to address that. We need to ensure that we have equitable and fair opportunities for everyone, not just by demographic, but also around the province. So when we think about creating jobs or stimulating recovery, we want to focus on jobs that are innovative, that are sustainable, that diversify our economy, that provide jobs to people who need them the most in every corner of the province. We also know, and this is a very core value, that we need to ensure that one of our tests is, will the investment help us meet our climate commitments? Will it help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as well as put people to work diversifying the economy. We want to be inclusive, so we want to pay attention to groups that have been marginalized. We want to ensure that we pay attention to new Canadians and deal, frankly, with the upsurge of some of the racism we've seen in British Columbia that we all need to stand together to oppose. We want to ensure that it advances reconciliation with First Nations in line with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People legislation that we brought forward. And we want to ensure that it's responsive to the greatest needs that we see in the province. The $1.5 billion will be a one-time investment. We know that we also need to look in future budget cycles at what can we do to entrench things in our budget that need to be ongoing because they demonstrably help us create jobs and stimulate the economy in a way that reflects our values. So today, Premier Horgan and Finance Minister James held a press conference, and they announced that over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be consulting with British Columbians, not about what our values should be, but about what people believe they need and what they'd like to see in a recovery. So MLAs, cabinet ministers will all be doing outreach over the next 6 weeks, but there's also an opportunity for people to engage directly. There's a survey at the gov.bc.ca website. It's a survey people can take. It's also an opportunity through an email portal that's embedded in there for people to simply send us their ideas. You know, we're asking fundamental questions like, what do we need to do together to have a good economic recovery? What is your top priority for economic recovery? What would most help improve your work life or work prospects? And are we on the right track as government, as a society, as British Columbians moving forward? I think you'll see important values reflected in the paper that we're putting forward for discussion. I think, I hope that what I've been able to say this evening is a reflection of important values that people on this call hold dear. But it's also important to note that there's a growing consensus, whether it's from environmental groups, from citizens, from climate activists, from the finance industry, from economists around the world, that we cannot afford to miss the opportunity to address the climate crisis that we're in and that is looming even worse as we address the COVID crisis. Because as one of my colleagues in cabinet said, there's no herd immunity for climate. There's no vaccination for climate. It's actually what we do together going forward in transforming the way we live and the way our economy is structured. So again, I urge everyone to participate. Thank you again, Andrew Weaver, for this great initiative of this town hall. Please, everyone, participate, and I'm sure I'll be hearing from Andrew and others on this Zoom tonight about what good ideas came forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Heyman, for attending this town hall and presenting government's direction on this. Yes, as Minister Heyman has mentioned, it is we worked very closely together over the last couple of years, and I will say that that has been the highlight of my time so far as an MLA in the legislature. It's been a very productive exchange of ideas, and it's been a very rewarding experience. So thank you again, Minister Heyman. So we'll move to the panel now, and with the panel we've got 4 distinguished panelists, and we have a special guest that I've was able to see was available, Maren Smith, and I'll introduce her later. Maren will help us with the question and answers later, as she comes directly from Clean Energy Canada, which is an organization that we'll discuss after the panelists have spoken. The 4 panelists will speak for 7 to 10 minutes, and then Maren will join us. I'll introduce her, and then we'll go directly to questions and answers so that we can address your questions with the expertise that's here, both within the CRD as well as more broadly in terms of the backgrounds people bring to the panel. First speaking will be Rob Gillizo. Rob joined the Department of Economics at the University of Victoria at the start of 2016. But prior to joining the department, he served as the chief economist in the office of the leader of the official opposition in Ottawa. Dr. Gillizo's research applies casual methodology from labor economics to answer questions in modern American and Canadian economic history. His work has examined questions related to the interaction of the war on poverty and the 1960s race riots, the growth of the North American trade union movement, and the role that the transatlantic slave trade played in the development of ethnicity on the African continent. More recently, Rob was seconded as, I believe it was Chief of Staff or Senior Ministerial Assistant with the Finance Minister in the BC government. I got to know Rob not as a fellow faculty member at the University of Victoria, but in our many, many discussions over the Confidence Supply Agreement when he was down in the legislature. Following Rob will be Emily de Rosenroll. She became in 2016 the inaugural CEO of the South Island Prosperity Partnership, a very exciting initiative here in southern Vancouver Island. She spearheaded a number of economic development initiatives, including the Regional Smart City Strategy, involving over 50 organizations and including 15 local governments. Drawing on her extensive governance and public-private expertise, the first phase of the strategy focuses on transportation and mobility, followed by a focus on building common data platforms, along with the measurement of mobility well-being. After that, Colin Plant was a Saanich councillor where I live in the Gordon Head riding. He's councillor representing the region I live in, but he's also the a chair of the Capital Regional District. He serves as the chair of the Arts, Culture and Heritage Committee and as chair of the Saanich LGBTQ2+ subcommittee. He's also a drama teacher at Claremont Secondary School and is chair of the Capital Regional District Board, as I mentioned. Originally from Salmon Arm, Mr. Plant graduated from Stelly Secondary, just north of the riding of Oak Bay Gordon Head in 1990. Well, he's a young fellow, that Mr. Plant, as the class valedictorian, and he's lived in Saanich for 15 years. After Colin, we'll conclude with Dr. Katja Rose, who's an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration and a member of the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at the University of Victoria. She investigates the topic of low-carbon economic transitions and climate policy design using survey tools, energy economy models, media and content analysis. Prior to joining academia, Dr. Rhodes worked in the British Columbia Climate Action Secretariat, where she led the greenhouse gas emissions modeling and economic analyses for the province's Clean BC plan. So clearly, I got to know Katja's work, Dr. Rhodes's work, in my capacity as an opposition MLA, and she was involved in a lot of the modeling aspects of the Clean BC plan that Minister Heyman referred to. And Rob, of course, Rob Gillizo, who is now a colleague, which I didn't realize he was from UVic, was also involved in many of the negotiations with respect to the BC Green Caucus at the time, for which I was in, and the BC government. So thank you to all the panelists. The outline of this town hall is, as I mentioned, the panelists will speak 7 to 10 minutes each. And following that, we'll bring Maren forward and then over to you for questions. We have incredible expertise on this panel. So the questions will be asked. If you look at your Zoom panel, down at the bottom, there's a Q&A. And on that Q&A, if you click it, you'll see that there's a space to ask questions. I have, fortunately, got some staff down here in the legislative office who will help me work through these questions to ensure that you are the focus, the audience, the panelists are the focus of this town hall, and that your questions are answered by our distinguished panel. So thank you again to everybody for joining us, and over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me pull up some slides. Hopefully those work okay. So, this is the right topic to be talking about today. I'm going to start with a little bit of context and then talk about a path forward. But when I think about the situation we're in now, right, the challenge facing all governments, including the provincial government here, including the federal government, is the largest economic crisis that we have faced in a century, right? We need to go back to the Great Depression to see anything like what we're seeing. But when you have a challenge of that scale, what the upside to it is that you have an opportunity. Because right, when you have a challenge, government typically needs to respond. That is why government is there. That is why government exists. And when you respond, right, it gives you an opportunity to shape what your country is going to look like. It gives you an opportunity to shape a path forward. And in this case, right, Canada and British Columbia in particular is extremely well prepared. So my game plan, in the couple of minutes that I have, I'll start off talking about the scale of the economic shock, its character. I'll talk about British Columbia's position in our ability to cope with it. And then I'll lay out what I think are a couple of the options that we could take as to how to pursue a response. And it's up to all of you, right? It's up to citizens in the province to decide which of those options we take. As experts, you know, I can tell you which things are a good idea, which things are a bad idea, but there's a large choice set of options within that, and it's up to your values and right what you want to see that determines where we're going to go. So that's the game plan, and let's hop into it. So, you know, if you looked at the stock market now, you might not feel like things have been that bad, right? The market has really gone through a really interesting recovery that I don't think is grounded in fundamentals, that I think a lot of economists are raising questions about. And right, if you think about how deep this recession has been, up here on the screen, I have the number of hours worked in the country. From before COVID, we have seen a 32% decline in hours worked across the country. Right? That is basically a 1/3 decline in the work being done. That is unprecedented. We have never had a drop of that scale. Certainly, right, the only equivalent drop would potentially be during the Great Depression in its very deepest months, right? When North America was on the edge of unraveling. But that took years, right? That wasn't instantaneous. That was a gradual deepening of a recession. In this case, we went from things were going relatively well, right? We were in normal times, growth was happy, wages were growing, to a Great Depression in 2 months, right? That is exceptional. And that burden hasn't been felt equally, right? As an academic, I am privileged to be in a position under, you know, I'm at home for multiple months. I had my toddler at home with me, and I wasn't working as productively as I normally would. But you know, I could make it work. Who has lost their job, right? If you're working on an airplane, if you're working in the transportation sector more broadly, if you're working in service provision, right? A lot of restaurant workers, a lot of retail workers. If you're working in recreation, right? It's easy to overlook recreation, but those industries have pretty much shut down entirely. And the broad character of the unemployment this time around is that it's happening in the service sector. And that's truly new, right? If we think back to 2008, that decline was heavily concentrated in blue-collar workers. But today we only have a 4% decline in construction. So it's a very different decline. The other lens you can look at for scale is GDP, right? So people hours is one, GDP is another. And in that respect, we saw a 9% decline in GDP in March and 11% in April. So, right, what you should take away is this is an exceptional shock. It dwarfs the recession that likely every single person on this call has lived through. And the response from government should mirror that. So, you know, where does that leave BC? We are very lucky to have had numerous governments, right, of all stripes who have been fiscally responsible, right? What shapes government's ability to respond to a crisis? It's their fiscal capacity. It's how much debt they carry. It's their revenues. And British Columbia, next to Alberta, has the healthiest finances in Canada. So, you know, people often ask, why don't we go and spend that money in regular times? Well, you don't spend it all in regular times in case this happens. And right, this is the moment that we are responsible for, right? It is now when the economy has declined so substantially that we can go out and spend. And you know, how does that play out? Well, BC has a AAA credit rating. We are one of the only subnational jurisdictions in the world with a AAA credit rating, meaning that when we borrow, we are going to pay a very small price to borrow. So we have a lot of space. So the decline has been huge. We have fiscal space. What should government look to do going forward? Well, you know, typically when you have an economic shock, you need to identify, is it to the supply side? Is it kind of like the increasing price of oil in the 1970s? Or is it to the demand side, like in the Depression where people lose their incomes and they can't buy anything? You know, this downturn was a little bit of both, right? We stopped producing to some degree because you couldn't leave your house oftentimes. So there was a supply element to the shock, but it's rapidly turned into a demand side decline. And so that means a lot of the usual levers that we think about for boosting the economy are going to work. So kind of lesson number one here is we want a big macroeconomic response. We want the federal and the provincial governments to spend a lot of money. And this is not likely going to be a one-year recession. We're looking at a minimum of, I would say, probably 2 years. And so that stimulus will need to be sustained. What are the kind of overall defining features of where that money should go? I mean, there's a challenge because of the virus, but as the virus is contained, we want stimulus to flow as rapidly as possible. We want stimulus to target the people who are out of work, right? If I go and hire a bunch of people who already have a job, that doesn't solve the problem. We need government to figure out who has lost their job and get work for them. And then we want things that have a cost today, but that are going to benefit us into the future, right? So those are three defining goals. Now, what are our options? We usually turn to traditional infrastructure, right? We go and we build some roads, we build some bridges. I don't know, maybe we build a new power plant. Or if you go back to the 1930s, you dig a hole in the ground and you fill it back up. Ideally, not that one. That works typically in that oftentimes blue-collar workers lose their work. It creates things that cost something now and benefit us over the long run. But it's not ideal today because construction is actually doing really well. So we can do some of this, but we can't do that much because all that's going to happen is you're going to be bidding up the same set of workers who are already at work. So the value there is actually relatively small. So we can do it, but it's more of a secondary option. An issue that is a personal favorite of mine and reflects very much the mandate of the government, but also of the third party in the House, is moving forward on childcare. This is something that's already been promised, and that's not a good enough reason to justify this. Why does it potentially make sense as a policy? It's service workers who have lost their jobs. It is largely women who have lost their jobs. And a lot of people are not able to return to work at all because they can't get into a childcare slot. And so if you were to drastically ramp up childcare provision by hiring, for example, more staff, taking advantage of buildings that are empty to hold childcare spaces in a way that pushes down costs and rolls out that system, that would create jobs. Now the tension is that doesn't feel short run, right? That feels permanent, and it is. But the unique feature here is that costs in childcare provision are high in the short run. But what actually happens over the longer run is that women, largely women, but also men, are able to have more successful careers. They don't take wage penalties that they would otherwise take. And so within 5 to 10 years, the experience from Quebec is that most of that money comes back to the province and the federal government. So it works from that perspective. The next really well-grounded option is looking at green spending, right? There's a dimension here that is going to be traditional infrastructure. And right there are issues with that, but there are lots of other ways to help on green spending. Right? In particular, you could think about all sorts of durable goods like refrigerators and so forth that are not building. It's actually buying a good, and you can infuse money into households with conditions about the greenness of those products and have that be your form of stimulus. You can also go and be creative, right? Since a lot of workers are on the service side, you can strengthen our environmental institutions as a form of stimulus. There are other options out there, and I'm sensitive to time, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but right, you can go and do grand quotation marks nation building projects. You can build new national or provincial parks. You can have a national service program, or you can do what the federal government has done and just send piles of checks to people. Those are all viable measures. Now, in my last 20 seconds, where would I recommend we go? This service sector dimension is key. Childcare is an obvious fit with the government's mandate, so I would encourage him to go there. For the other half, I think that it's clear that voters in British Columbia care about the environment. I think that it fits either from an infrastructure perspective or from a subsidy to households. My main advice would be, particularly on the green point, is we make sure that it's equitable, right? We don't need programs that go and subsidize high-income earners to buy a new fridge. Right? We want to make sure that people who really can't afford the new fridge or can't afford the clean vehicle, that they're the ones who get it. So make sure that that money is income tested when it goes out the door. So those are just some defining principles. I'm very grateful for the chance to be here. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you, Dr. Guillozeau. That was very enlightening. I see we have some questions coming in on the Q&A. I'll hold those until after all the panelists have spoken. We'll move to Emily now, and over to you, Emily. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. A pleasure to be here and a pleasure to follow after Rob's presentation, which was wonderful, and I think set the stage very, very well. I don't have slides prepared, so I'm just going to start speaking. My name is Emily DeRosenroll, and I'm the CEO of the South Island Prosperity Partnership. And the Prosperity Partnership, for those of you who might not know it, was an organization that was created in 2016, so quite recently. And we were established in order to really stimulate economic development in the region that is inclusive and sustainable and helps diversify our economy. So we were initially about 29 members, and those represent a mixture of municipalities, First Nation communities, all the post-secondary institutions, many business and industry associations, and now actually over 30 of the largest employers of the region. So now we're up to about 65 members, and it's very much a diverse and essentially a grassroots-driven organization that attempts to really sort of open up Greater Victoria to the world and bring as much as we can of the world into Greater Victoria. So a lot of what we're doing, especially in recent months, is what we were actually initially set up to do. So after the recession, the last recession, the Great Recession, our region actually did not bounce back as quickly as many regions across Canada. And so the thinking at the time was, what are other regions of the country doing to sort of self-organize and help fill that gap? So at that time, we looked at it and realized that we were funding economic development, regional economic development, at a rate much lower, and actually still continues to be fair bit lower than the average for mid-sized city regions, and therefore there started the impetus behind our organization to really create this new entity. So essentially what we're here for is to create that sort of collaborative network and that fabric that's required to be able to rebound in situations like this faster. So we're essentially a big tent, and we work on obviously several different projects, but for the time being the focus really is on economic recovery. So in the recent months, we've set up something called the Rising Economy Task Force, and that's a group of 41 individuals who represent very diverse parts of our economy, from finance and capital to oceans and marine, retail and restaurants, the inclusive economy, Indigenous, and so on. So a very, very broad spectrum of focus and a very, approach that is as inclusive as possible. So that group is a group that meets monthly and takes a look at the very high level of things. At a more micro and sector specific level, we also have set up 12 committees, and these committees are established to look specifically at their sectors and really understand what are the unique characteristics of each sector, where are the opportunities, where are the ongoing vulnerabilities going to be. So taking a deep dive into those topics. The next step for those committees is to develop recommendations for each sector grouping, and be able to, based on that research that's being done right now, a lot of it's survey work, we're able to say, okay, these are the priorities for each sector. So in terms of moving ourselves from a relief situation in many cases towards a greater recovery, and then of course building in resilience, how do we do that? So those are the reports that they'll be available, and we will be doing public presentations of them over in September. The reports will be finalized over the summer. And so that's the point where in the fall, we'll be able to take this information and build that into a regional economic recovery strategy by taking, in particular, areas that are going to be thematic across all these sectors and looking at those are the areas that are, of course, going to generate the broadest impact for the region. So it's a big undertaking, an important undertaking, and something that we have, probably close to 100 different individuals in the region, all rolling up their sleeves and contributing a great deal of their time and brain power to doing this for us. So we're quite excited about that. I think from here, I'd like to spend a little bit of time about the importance of developing our own unique recovery story in Greater Victoria. So by that, you know, we've all heard, and Rob mentioned some of these just now. We've heard about these sort of top-down narratives about what's going on in the economy, and we even hear, if you look at the stock market, there's a sort of V-shaped recovery model that suggests that, you know, as deep as we fell into the hole, we'll rebound, we'll come out the other side just as quickly, and that has actually occurred to some degree in the stock market, and most people are just think that's absolutely, you know, nuts. It has nothing to do with reality, and certainly doesn't reflect the pain that people are feeling at the household level, which is extraordinarily impactful and unprecedented. So I think the story for us, or the reminder for me, the cautionary tale, is that we need to really make sure that you know, the statistics are completely irrelevant at a sort of macro or, you know, big scale level. What's really important is that as communities, we really understand what exactly is happening to us. Where are we experiencing job losses? How is that not the same story as Vancouver or Northern BC, or of course, Alberta or Saskatchewan or Ontario and the Maritimes and so forth? So that piece is actually quite critical, because it means that we don't want to fall into gaps because our story isn't known. So in Greater Victoria, I'd suggest our story, our story is largely about an economy that's quite dependent on the sectors that are being the hardest hit. So tourism, services, also restaurants, retail, etc. So we're definitely an economy that is largely dependent on tourism. And as a result, our jobs are quite at risk right now. So it's something that we need to think about. There are some sectors that are going up, you know, that they're seeing opportunities, they're actually growing. And those are largely the technology sector, advanced manufacturing, but predominantly software, where we see a big, what we call cluster in our region. And that's an area that is actually doing quite well. But a lot of areas are not doing well. So travel and transportation, tourism, services, retail, restaurants, of course. So that's an important story, just to understand the differences between what's going up and what's going down, and then the relative difference of those. I mean, and we're talking, when we hear sometimes about, you know, bike sales are going up, well, that's great, but that's still a drop in the bucket. So we have to keep in mind the scale at which we are being impacted. So that's one point to make. The fact that that's an uneven impact on our regional economy. The other comment to make is that it's uneven in terms of how it is impacting our actual population as well. And Rob also alluded to some of that as well. So women, of course, are being majorly impacted. That's one that's been spoken about a lot, that we're looking at, because it's a service-led recession as opposed to a goods-led recession. We're actually experiencing something like a she-cession. So that's relevant and very important to think about. The other thing that's important to think about is that those who are at the margin are often more impacted. So minorities, gig or casual workers, immigrants, youth, etc. So we really have to remember the importance of taking care of those of us that are most vulnerable. And this is certainly the time where the inequities can grow. So we have to find ways to make sure that we're not building as we go forward, we're not leaving more of us behind. So I think those are two pieces. The third trend that we're seeing is that people are paramount. There is nothing more important into our economy than our people. Investing in them is absolutely critical. When we think about Greater Victoria, we typically have an unemployment rate that is virtually zero. You know, the amount, what we call a labor market that's super constricted. So we often have lots of members who would hire, and even right now, interestingly, they would hire 100 people overnight easily, but they can't, because there is usually what's called, big skills mismatch. So what we're looking at right now is that's not going to be the biggest story, that our labor, that our economy is going to be constricted by a tight labor market. However, so that's going to be eased a little bit. But what we are going to find is a dramatic mismatch of skills between what is needed in this new and next economy and the displaced workers from sectors that no longer need those employees. So to me, education and skills training should be absolutely top of mind for us going forward. It is absolutely critical. Going forward, it won't take too much longer, you know, a few more years, probably we'll go back to this tight labor market again. But something to keep in mind is that immigration is majorly constricted, and typically that has always been the way that Canada relies on feeding its labor market needs and also actually increasing its GDP. So that's not on the table anymore. We really have to do more with the people that we have. We have to take care of them and bring up the skills. So that's my third point. My fourth would be that what we're seeing is also there's a lot of opportunity, and there's opportunity for innovation. There's opportunity to do things differently than we've done them before. So we've been getting our lead investors, we call them our members, together for Zoom sessions where we ask people, you know, looking back a year from now, what are the types of things you want to see more of, and what do you want to see less of in the next economy? And we've really gotten some inspirational answers. So I think some of the trends are, obviously, technology is no longer a thing of the technology sector. It's impacting all of us. Look at what we're doing right now. We're all in our dining rooms, if you're like me, doing a Zoom session and reaching out to so many people around the province and around the region. So technology is something that everybody is now doing. It's becoming much more of a mainstay. Now, having said that, there's pros and cons, but the pros are we are finding ways to connect in ways that previously didn't seem feasible. The other side of that is that we're accelerating a lot of technology adoption that might have taken several years to have done, and now we're doing it very, very quickly. And it's impacting sectors that might have been more traditional sectors. So that's creating a whole bunch of new innovations that we'll see, and I think those will be really exciting to look at in agri-foods, for example, and others. The second one is climate. There's a huge opportunity, I think, to do infrastructure, green infrastructure, and all kinds of things that would kickstart the economy in a way that you know, as Rob said too, this isn't a recovery like the 1930s depression. We don't need to literally dig holes and sometimes fill them back up to get people back to work. That's sort of not what we're looking at right now. The infrastructure, this was an emergency, and yet all of our buildings are intact. All of our roads are intact. We haven't gone through an actual physical earthquake. This was more of an earthquake of the economy. So it's something else. The focus on infrastructure can look a lot different than it has in the past. I would also add to that digital infrastructure is now very, very key. Perhaps a topic for another day, but looking at how the places around the world that have done I think some of the best in terms of managing the crisis, the current pandemic crisis, and doing it in a way where their economy has stayed as hot, you know, about 90% output has remained in place. Those are the ones that they have quite a lot of digital capacity. They're able to do tracing, testing, etc. at a much larger number. So that means you can kind of open up your economy, let more things happen, let more activities resume, and do that in a way that you're sort of managing what are known as kind of black swan events. So this is one of these events we didn't expect, and sort of our ability to be able to manage that. I think we'll see the next 10, 20 years, it's going to be all digital. So the third point would be that inclusion is something that we have to keep front and foremost as we go through this. And I think inclusion for me isn't just, it certainly is about childcare. I think that is critical, but it's also about making sure that we have an economy that's future focused. So what are the jobs that are going to be in demand in the next 10 years? Where do we know the opportunities are going to lie. How are we preparing our current workforce for those opportunities to make sure that BC is competitive, Greater Victoria is competitive in the future? And we know that a lot of the way that the economy is moving, it's more towards what we call intangibles. And Alan Winter, BC's Innovation Commissioner, recently produced his final report, and it had a lot of very, very important recommendations in there about moving the economy, moving BC's economy towards this more competitive place. And because BC has typically just done very well, the innovation side we've been complacent on that, and it says that in the report as well. So I think those are just some early trends that we're looking at and we're noticing, and I'm really very much looking forward to seeing what kind of innovative ideas come out of the committee work. With that, I will complete my discussion. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Emily. And Colin, you're next as the councillor from Saanich and also the CRD board chair. Colin, you failed the Zoom test. You must turn on your sound. No, you're Colin. This is there we go.
There we go. And I'm the school teacher who does this 2 or 3 times a day. So I'm very sorry, everybody.
It's one of the most common things to say in a Zoom town hall is please turn on the microphone.
Yeah. I'm assuming you can hear me now. Yes, fantastic.
Yes, we can.
My apologies, everybody. Andrew, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and it's very nice to work beside these other people who are speaking tonight. I am here in Royal Oak, so I'm going to acknowledge with great respect that I'm here on the traditional territories of the Wasanich people. And I'm going to provide a little bit of a perspective from the Capital Regional District perspective and perhaps from the local government perspective. The fact is that we are not yet out of this by any stretch from our perspective in the local government. And I think in order to provide a little bit of context where I think we as an organization and perhaps therefore the region is going to go, I need to provide a little bit of understanding for people who may not be familiar with what structure we have in this region. So I think everybody who lives in Greater Victoria will know that we have 13 municipalities and 3 electoral areas. Those 16 different entities are represented on a CRD board of 24, and we make decisions for the betterment of the region through services. And so those services are what we base our decisions on. We don't have social policies, perhaps like the provincial and federal governments can implement to make significant changes right away. Our processes are by providing services, and those services affect quality of life. So for people wondering what kind of services are we talking about, we're talking about water, we're talking about regional parks, we're talking about wastewater, and so those sort of things. So we also, like other provincial levels of municipal government, do not have the ability to run into a deficit position. So when I hear about the great opportunities to borrow, we can borrow for projects and we can borrow long-term for projects, but we can't run a debt per se as an operating budget debt. And so that is something that makes the expectations that people have for what local governments can do sometimes unfortunately unrealistic. And that's why we often then more likely find ourselves in a position to work with other levels of government. The CRD's motto, I think rather appropriately fits the idea of where we're going and where we've been recently, which is making a difference together. And that speaks to the fact that there's 13 municipalities and we're constantly trying to work together, but also as a province and as a country, we are trying to work together right now. So the way that I've approached today is I would offer that the way that we are currently responding is one of providing services and maintaining them. And we've been able to do that through the good advice of the Provincial Health Officer and the Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General. And we thus far, knocking on wood, have found that we've been able to provide those services with the exception of recreation centers that we run in the electoral areas and in Central Saanich on behalf of the peninsula. So those facilities have closed, but everything else we've actually kept going. And I would speculate none of you have noticed that your water has stopped running. None of you have noticed that the landfill has closed. None of you have noticed that your toilet, when it flushes, isn't backing up. And so I consider that a great success that we take for granted. But going forward, that's the thing. We haven't had the luxury yet to sit down and dream as a board about what we want as a result of this pandemic. But I think the work we've previously done sets us up really well. And so in preparing to speak tonight, I thought, well, what could I offer? Because as chair of the board, I'm not a mayor. I lead a voice, pardon me, I am the voice for 24 members of that board, but I don't have any individual ability to say, that's what's going to happen. And so I would actually offer that the strategic initiatives that the CRD board established in 2018 will provide the map on how we hope to work with other levels of government to get to a new future. And certainly, as one member of that board, I will say the new future is not going to look like the old future, but our old goals serve us well. And so I think I'd like to just offer a little bit of explanation what I'm referring to when I say these strategic initiatives. And when I mention them, I think people are going to say, yes, I think this does fit into a potential vision. I'm also going to apologize and stop for a second. I'm scratching and batting my head because I decided it would be a great idea to sit outside in my backyard and do this Zoom chat. And it's the first time I've ever done a Zoom chat outside. There's mosquitoes in the CRD. And I didn't think there were supposed to be mosquitoes in the CRD. So whenever you see me do this, it's not because I have a nervous tick or anything. That would be okay if I did. But it's because there's mosquitoes out here today.
May I suggest you contact Saanich Council to deal with it?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. I'm also going to call the MLA for Oak Bay Gordon Head to see what he can do as well. But yeah, at least for another year. So I was saying how the CRD Strategic Initiatives, I think, will show us the future for how we want to see the provincial and federal government work with us and how we hope they will support what we do. Because what Dr. Gillizo said, for example, was the investment. That's what's coming. We know that there's certainly the immediate taking care of people through CERB, to the provincial $1,000 that's been made available, but what's next? And clearly the V, as much as we wish it would happen, isn't going to happen. It's going to take a period of time that is going to result in people being unemployed for a longer period of time than we want and going back to a new job. So here are the themes that we at the CRD are exploring in our vision for the region, and see if these align with what you might think would be part of a new future that we all would want. We are focused on transportation and housing. We want multimodal green transportation that will allow us to meet our climate targets. We want housing. We want non-market housing that allows people to have a home and to not be homeless. This is what the CRD has as a strategic initiative before this happened, but it feels like this would be something that could be invested in. Climate action, environmental stewardship. This is an opportunity to do projects that will set us forward with a better environment because of the type of work we're doing. First Nations reconciliation. When we talked about inclusivity and leaving nobody behind, this is another opportunity to make sure that we are working with our First Nations. The UNDRIP legislation that has recently passed in British Columbia hasn't really started to show an impact on how decisions are being made, but it's coming. And so when we do that, we have to make sure that those types of decisions are being made with First Nations participation. And I would suggest that there is alignment there for the type of investment to include First Nations participation. And then the other piece is better governance and accountability. We at the board are always interested in doing things better, but what does that mean? Well, we've been doing our meetings like this. And so people who typically aren't aware of the Capital Regional District's work are now able to watch us and are able to listen and phone in. So it's a different way of doing business than we've ever done. And so hopefully this technology, as much as it sucks when the person doesn't hit the unmute button, will allow people to participate more. On the economic piece, which I'll end with, I just want to say the Capital Regional District is a significant employer and an economic engine. When you think of the largest ever project on Vancouver Island, it's happening right now. And that is the $775 million wastewater treatment project. And so that has employed hundreds of people. And we are going to then see continued investment in housing and in hospitals because we are getting more involved in housing. So when we as local governments get the funding and the opportunity to work with other levels of government to provide infrastructure and to do projects, we then become a part of that economic engine. And we typically, even though there's always the government's the wasteful and overspending, we provide quality jobs. And so I don't accept that we're always wasteful and that sort of notion, especially at the local government level, where you can look in the people's eyes when they pass the budget and say, what's going on in your municipality, in your region. So I would think that the role of local governments and the capital regional district to work with the other levels of government to say, here's the type of investment our community needs now and in the future, is something that we are providing in our current strategic documents, and we are ready. Right now, we're still working on getting our parks open. We're still working to get everybody back in the building. But I really look forward to the opportunity when we can sit down in a month or two and just say, what do we want going forward? What is our vision? But we're not there yet as the local government, and it's a luxury that I feel a little jealousy towards other levels and other people, because they're already thinking ahead that way. But we're still making sure that the mom and the dad who want to go play in the playground can do that in a safe way and can go to a regional park. But I really want to thank you for having me a part of this, and I really want to hear some questions, and I thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. And I'll stop now, and if I turn off my screen and go inside, you'll know it's the mosquitoes.
Thank you very much, Colin. Sorry you have to put up with mosquitoes. I'm putting up with the temperature down in the legislative basement, which is, I think it's a sauna down here. So over to you, Dr. Rose Cachorros. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Rob, Emily, and Colin for sharing your valuable thoughts and perspectives. I'm speaking from my home office in Broadmead, so I would like to acknowledge that I'm located on the traditional territory of Saanich people. It was very encouraging today to hear from Minister Heyman and Premier Horgan earlier in the afternoon that the BC government is planning to take climate change mitigation into account when implementing recovery measures to build a strong and resilient economy. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my suggestions for how to build this kind of low carbon economy in terms of designing future green stimulus proposals. So my short speech covers what governments should not do and what they should do based on existing research and based on past crisis recovery experiences to ensure that we in fact have a low carbon recovery. So first of all, I would like to say that we academics can be a downer because we tend to pop people's balloons. In the case of COVID-19 recovery stimulus, when we are trying to create new jobs and we are trying to drive market investments into low carbon solutions, I, as an energy climate policy expert, would like to point out that we don't need to focus our efforts on energy efficiency. Energy efficiency does not move us on the rapid decarbonization path, only fuel switching does. This is important because a lot of green stimulus proposals that are currently announced in European jurisdictions and North American jurisdictions focus exclusively on energy efficiency. In fact, in the last decade and most recently, research shows more and more that energy efficiency programs are less effective than thought. And this is because modeling experts and analysts don't take into account non-financial costs and rebound effects associated with energy efficient equipment and technology. Specifically, energy efficiency advocates don't consider perceived risks associated with purchasing energy efficient technologies. These technologies always have long payback periods and higher failure risks. In cases where energy efficiency is in fact adopted, it often leads to rebound effects associated with increased efficiency that lowers the operating cost of an energy service, such as car travel or home heating, which stimulates an increased demand and in turn leads to a higher energy consumption and higher greenhouse gas emissions. So accounting for this non-financial costs and rebound effects of energy efficiency is critical when considering energy efficiency as part or as the key component of any green stimulus package. In fact, Professor Mark Jackert, in his new book on the Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, explains that the fossil fuel industry recognizes this kind of aspects of energy efficiency. And this is why the industry loves and encourages energy efficiency in gasoline burning vehicles, in diesel burning trucks, and natural gas and oil home heating, as well as natural gas burning in industry. So just to repeat myself, energy efficiency keeps us on the fossil fuel path, and this strategy has been successful for the fossil fuel industry in the last 30 years, with environmental advocates being their victims. So what should we do? I suggest that any green stimulus should focus on fuel switching. And what could that be? So number one, I suggest that we invest money in home retrofits that replace natural gas or oil with electricity and or wood in near zero emission burners. Number two, I suggest that we design subsidies and regulations that require and help all condos and townhouse complexes to install electric vehicle rechargers for each residence. New research out of Simon Fraser University from Dr. John Axon shows that home recharging is key for electric vehicle adoption, and not recharging at work and not recharging when shopping. And also would like to point out that there may be not much money for government targeted spending, especially on the climate file. So governments need to keep going with tightening the existing climate regulations with market flexibility features that stimulate those low carbon market investments. So examples include the low carbon fuel standard that we have in British Columbia that requires decreasing average carbon intensity of transportation fuels and therefore drives biofuel investment, and the zero emission vehicle mandate that requires car manufacturers to sell a higher percentage of zero emission vehicles over time, helping to turn over the vehicle stock, again, with fuel efficiency, fuel switching. These are my key messages for the design of green stimulus policies and proposals for BC to move forward. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome questions.
Thank you, Katja. So before I proceed with the questions, I just would like to introduce Maren Smith, who's so very kindly agreed to join us on the panel to assist with the questions. Maren is a fellow at Simon Fraser University and the founder of Clean Energy Canada, a leading think tank advancing clean growth and climate solutions. She works with industry, government, and civil society influencers to solve pressing social and ecological challenges. Her leadership in the landmark Great Bear Rainforest Conservation Agreement helped ensure the protection of thousands of kilometers of coastal ecosystem. Maren is a Canadian representative on the International Clean Energy Ambassador Corps and is the recipient of numerous distinctions, including the 2016 Wendy MacDonald Community Catalyst Award from the Vancouver Board of Trade and the Clean 16 Award in 2014 for her leadership in clean catalysm. More recently, Maren has served on the Minister of Environment's advisory team, both in the first and second reincarnation of those, to advise the government as to how it can implement now the Clean BC targets. Before we, I have quite a number of questions. I thank everyone, 17 questions so far in queue. I wanted to say I was very pleased to hear the panelists speak, and I also wanted to acknowledge that, in my view, the reason why we decided to hold this town hall is because, like climate change, like any other challenge that society faces, I've always viewed these challenges nothing more than an opportunity for innovation and creativity as we emerge from the challenge. If you look in human history, and Rob, as an economic historian, will be the first to attest, you'll see that some of our greatest changes in societies have occurred after we've dealt with major challenges, whether it be the baby boom or whether it be many other technology innovations. A lot of these have occurred after society or local societies have faced these challenges. Minister Heyman referenced this article, this report here today. This is the report that government issued today, providing indication as to how British Columbians can participate in government's consultation process for the post-COVID recovery. And one of the reasons why I showed that is I would like to emphasize just some numbers to build on what Dr. Gillizo mentioned. If you look at the BC industry's biggest job losses as a direct consequence of COVID-19, there's been 13% of all jobs have been lost in BC, of which 54% were women. However, when you look at and you break this down, you find that 50% of jobs in the accommodation and food services were lost, and 29% in other services except government, 22% in information, culture, and recreation, 19% in retail trade, 14% in construction. But when you go to the biggest one, accommodation and food services, fully 65% of those job losses were women. So clearly, government has recognized, as Rob has articulated, the fact that this is quite different from previous recessions. This is not a system-wide recession. This has really targeted low-income workers, and in particular, it's targeted women in the accommodation and food sectors, as well as in the information, culture, and recreation sectors. And in other services except governmental, fully 70% of the job losses were women. So clearly this is something we must think about as we move forward. And with that, we'll move to questions, and the first question comes from Laurent Mingo, who says this. It's kind of a broad question, but I think it's important because it encapsulates some of the arguments. He says this: thank you for this town hall and the opportunity to interact. My question is to Andrew Weaver, but also indirectly to George Heyman. Andrew, can you tell me if I should be convinced by the provincial NDP's willingness in tackling the climate crisis, in being serious about climate change, when we see the continuing quest with LNG and the suspension of many environmental regulations in this province, with a source there to a National Observer article? If the answer is yes, are BC carbon emission reductions in line with the Paris Accord? So I will say that over the last it's been more than 3 years now, I've had a very collaborative working arrangement with government. I will say that things were a little tense early on when government got elected, but for two reasons. Number one is the BC NDP had been in opposition for a very long time, and governing was new to them. And number two is BC Greens had never had a caucus before, and not the least of which never had a caucus holding balance of responsibility in a minority government. So there was a lot of learning going on initially. I will say, and I think George articulated that I'm convinced now that the BC NDP government is quite serious about climate change. I'm convinced that they recognize that this challenge is really an opportunity to innovation. I've spent many hours discussing with Minister Heyman, Minister James, the Premier, Minister Mungell, Minister Ralston, Minister Eby, and others about this issue, and it's taken time. Some within their caucus clearly were well ahead, but when you govern, you're often in reliance. You don't suddenly turn on a coin, on a dime. There's some inertia within the civil service that takes time to change. The direction needs to change. I truly believe that Premier Horgan and his government do recognize that climate change, and in particular the post-COVID recovery, provides an opportunity for innovation in a clean economy moving forward. I've seen some very positive signs, and frankly, I've said it before, I'll say it again, I don't ever believe LNG Canada will be built because the markets do not support shipping gas out of BC when it's going to cost $10 to land it in Asia, and the price of landed LNG is $3 and change. I don't know how it will ever become economic, so I'll believe it when I see it. But what we can say, additional to this question, is the biggest greenhouse gas reduction plan that has hit British Columbia has been COVID-19. Emissions have dropped something like 15% globally as a direct consequence in a short period of time of industrial shutdown. This isn't a good thing, of course, from an economic perspective, but it does say that as we rebuild, if we do things differently, we're starting off at a different trajectory. So I am hopeful. Admittedly, I'm quite optimistic at the best of time, but I have seen without a doubt, and people who know me know I'm not one to mince words, a change in the thinking of government, and I believe that Premier Horgan and his cabinet are all in supporting a clean approach to rebuilding our economy, and that I say with some conviction. I'll move on to the next question. I'm going to ask a question from Dana Taylor. It's directed to Rob Gillizo. It's, what is the economic impact of children in the Quebec experience, and how does it influence economic stability?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the only reason we actually have good evidence on doing childcare in other provinces is because of Quebec. So they had a bit of an experiment, and thank goodness it worked out really, really well. That's not to say that it's perfect, but so what is the economic impact? It was rolled out. There was an upfront cost, right? Childcare certainly doesn't pay for itself in the first year, in the second year, or the third year. And why does that happen? Well, where are the big gains, right? One big gain is about parents, but largely women, right, choosing to re-enter the workforce. But if you re-enter the workforce at the age of, say, 50, if you didn't go to university, right, you're going to enter in a certain type of position. Where we get the really big gains from childcare when it's universally accessible is people make different decisions, right? So maybe when you were 20, you decided, instead of deciding to be a stay-at-home parent, you said, I'm going to go to university, I'm going to get a career because I am confident that we can get access to childcare, and then my earnings end up being that much higher. So what's happened in Quebec is that starting maybe 4 or 5 years after the program was rolled out, they started seeing these huge returns. And it's actually big enough that for a long time, Quebec was one of the more problematic cases in terms of fiscal stability in the country. Different set of spending, different views with respect to the role of the safety net. But about a decade after childcare, Quebec is now probably second to British Columbia in the second best fiscal position in the country. And that's a result of many decisions, but having a large increase in revenue because of a policy choice is extremely helpful. But I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Rob. The next question is from, I just had it here, from Jim Hesser. It's a very good question that we've arranged it that panelists will put up their hand if they wish to answer. It's with respect to arts and culture. And Jim says this: the arts and culture are being hard hit in Victoria. How do we best help ensure their excellence and survival? Is there a panelist who wishes to address the arts and culture issue? Colin, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have the ability to do the yellow hand up in the corner, so I'll do my real one. So I can address this from the Capital Regional District and a little bit from Saanich as well. And certainly nobody's going to argue that the fact that we can't have gatherings larger than 50 is going to have an impact. The Capital Regional District offers an arts service, and one of the main functions of that art service is to fund arts organizations that have been making art, and that's both in operating and in project grants. I'm a member of that commission, and what I can tell you is thus far, we have been providing the grants even though the seasons are not being operating, because we look at the investment in these organizations as a long-term investment. And so we are not at thus far doing the thing that maybe people would be expecting, is that you're not going to fund something that's not going to happen. And so that is something that we certainly have done for 2020. Whether or not we could do that again for 2021 would be a good question to have. Certainly what we are noticing is that organizations are being innovative, and they're trying to find different ways to respond to that. Some of the larger organizations are not going to be as nimble to do that. A symphony, an opera, a dance company is not going to necessarily be able to put something on the internet quite as easy. So I think what we have to do is take into account, and I paraphrased this at the CRD board a little while ago when I paraphrased, and it was a bit of a butchering of the Churchill quote about when you're in war, what they said, should we cut arts funding? And his paraphrased response, and some don't even attribute it to him, was that what are we fighting this war for? Like, why are we trying to get back to normal? What are we trying to get? Is to get those arts and cultural organizations to go back to. So from my perspective, we need to support these as cultural organizations that have great value in and of themselves. So from my perspective at the CRD, we will continue to fund those grants and organizations that provide that, knowing that that only makes up about a third of their revenue. The other third comes from ticket sales, and then usually another third through philanthropy. So I know that's probably not a satisfying answer to Mr. Hesser, like what are we going to do? Certainly from the local government perspective, we're going to support these organizations.
Thank you, Colin. The next question is from Thomas Hackney, who I believe would be the Thomas Hackney from the BC Sustainable Energy Association. And it's to all panelists. Would you support a BC-wide program to upgrade the energy efficiency of the entire building stock? I suspect it would be appropriate for Maren to start this, as this is right up her alley. And then maybe we could move to any other panelists who would like to address it after her.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Well, I think what Katja said is true, that the fuel shifting is really key to actually reducing carbon emissions. And so one of the things that's key to do is to do energy retrofits and upgrade homes and buildings to shift off to gas into electric heat pumps that are now, ready for prime time. 5 years ago, they were very expensive. Now the costs have come down, just like they have on solar and electric vehicles, so they can create an affordable situation. So that kind of energy retrofit, key and critical, and one that we have to do if we're going to reduce emissions in our building stock. I would say that the energy efficiency retrofits in terms of buildings, putting in double paned windows, insulating, I'm here in Oak Bay with you, Andrew. There's a lot of houses around here that have no insulation in the walls or in the roof, and that kind of work is something that actually could be funded through stimulus in terms of you can get people back to work quickly. And you can, we call those shovel-worthy jobs, not just shovel-ready, but shovel-worthy, in that they're doing something as well. They're increasing affordability for people and reducing carbon emissions. So yes, retrofitting the building stock is a huge opportunity for stimulus right now, but also something that's got to happen. Buildings are around for 100 years plus, and so every year we've got to be building that. That's part of the Climate Council's recommendations to the government, one of the recommendations.
Katja, would you like to build on that?
I completely agree with what Maren just said. I just want to emphasize that I didn't intend to discourage all energy efficiency. Any energy efficiency that leads to fuel switching is the way to go. We need to move away from natural gas and electrify everything.
Thank you. Any others? If not, we can move. Oh, Rob.
Yeah, so I'm supportive, but I think a really key thing is making sure that you go in the right order, right? Because we do have finite resources, and right, do we want to help the person in the rich mansion down the road do this first? I mean, we could. We get the same, right? Maybe we get the same environmental impact, but we don't get the same economic impact, right? If we put that money in the pocket of someone who's on the edge, right, who might lose their house otherwise, and then can spend a little bit more, that's a bigger impact. So if you want to do it really safely, I would actually probably start with public housing and move out from there. Because once you get into private housing, then you are almost by definition, right, you're subsidizing, at least in Victoria, most people are renters. You're subsidizing the chosen few who happen to own a property.
I tend to agree with that. No, Katja, sorry.
And I just want to second Rob's thoughts, because as with any subsidy, there are lots of free riders, and it's really hard to identify them. So starting in the right place is very important.
Yes, I agree. And I think Maren's about to agree as well. Maren?
I do, and I would add to that list, start with social housing, then public buildings, schools, hospitals, where we're all paying the bills for those, Indigenous housing, which also is very poor quality, and retrofit. So completely agree with Rob, and just add a few more.
Thank you. Next question is to Emily. It's anonymous. It's, what solutions do you see beyond international tourism? And on the tech side, what is the scale of potential growth for recovery, and what is it?
It's a good question. I'll attempt to answer as best as I can. The tech sector in Greater Victoria is actually the largest sector. It's bigger. It is bigger than tourism. Where we see the biggest strengths within that sector here are particularly in software development, which is also very broad. So what's interesting about software is it kind of crosses all sectors. And so when you look at the global trends, a lot of folks would speculate that that sort of boom of the app, those companies that shot up and became gazillionaires overnight with hoodies and so on, that kind of era is sort of over. It sort of kind of hit its height, and now it's on the decline. Now the places where you see technology really becoming more predominant are actually in industries and sectors that are more highly regulated and actually more complicated and are harder to kind of crack into, and they're more complex. So that's actually good news for Canada in general, how we're sort of made up. Good news for Greater Victoria in that we also have very strong sort of complementary sectors and industries. So I think you'll see the sort of the next wave of technology boom really coming from technology that starts to move into all different areas. So public health is a big one. Anything from, you could say, law, ocean marine. Ocean marine is a huge space for Greater Victoria as well, very important sector. I never like to say one sector is more important than another. They're not, they're all very important. We'll start seeing actually technology even become very important. We already are seeing that, but in agriculture, food and beverage, and other sort of sectors that we think of as less techy, they're all very techy. And we've heard that a lot in BC generally, mining, all of these area, forestry, of course, they're all very high tech. But what we need to start seeing happen is that we do less importing of our tech, which is what we've been doing. We've been sort of exporting a lot of raw natural resources for quite a long time, importing our technology, and then applying it to those sectors. So we need to start seeing those numbers go way down, because we're still really a largely like kind of an extraction economy.
Thank you, Emily. Here's a question. It's actually obviously to Katja. It's from Cheryl Sacamano. I'm sorry, apologies for the pronunciation. It's an interesting specific example, but I think it might lead to a discussion. Thank you for your presentation on energy efficiency. That was Katja. Here is an example. Please comment on this example. My husband and I were told by an appliance repairman that in order to satisfy current energy efficient standards, many household appliances such as refrigerators and washing machines are now built with smaller motors which have to work harder and are not and do not last as long as previous motors for these applications. So they are not truly energy efficient. Is this true? Thank you. I don't know the answer to that. I'm putting you on the spot there, Katja. I don't know whether you do, but if any other panelist does, I will say that it is one of my personal pet peeves is that there are so many appliances that we buy that have built-in obsolescence. I won't name brands, but I can give two examples. One is a vacuum cleaner where the actual on-off switch had a little glass rod in, which was designed as built-in obsolescence. When it broke, people would throw their vacuum cleaner away. It's a $5 fix to replace the glass rod by a metal rod, and you could use your vacuum cleaner forevermore. The other one was a dishwasher we had, where there's a dishwasher where the handle had a plastic lever. That handle broke. It cost $500 for a new dishwasher, or $5 to find a part to replace the handle. People don't replace the handles, and this built-in obsolescence is something that personally I find egregious, but I don't know whether you have a specific answer to this, Katja, or any other panelists with respect to the motors.
Oh, well, I will not comment specifically on the motors, but this is a perfect example of why I take into account non-financial costs of any new technologies in the work that I do. So those type of things that have that lead to higher expenditures associated with operating a new technology due to higher failure risks of new technologies, those things are absolutely critical to take into account when you try to estimate economic and greenhouse gas impacts of new technologies. I have my own personal example. I bought an electric vehicle last year, and one of the small pins broke in the charging port, and it was a complete nightmare to replace the charging port infrastructure, given the lack of skills. People trained in electric vehicle infrastructure, they're not quite knowledgeable about the technology, given the lack of replacement materials and just generally very expensive to replace. So when thinking about new technologies, and especially energy efficiency, it's important to take into account higher failure risks and higher longer payback periods into account in order to properly assess the effects of those technologies on emission reductions.
Thank you. We have a question here from Ron Stevenson. He says, thank you to the panelists for their perspectives. Much attention has been directed towards sustainability, climate crisis adaptation and mitigation in many communities. In BC, however, it is clear that through the pandemic that this is not going to prepare us for what comes next. The transition town movement out of the UK stresses resiliency as the key for communities to survive and thrive in all kinds of situations, and I'll add, not only climate change. Whether it is a second wave of the pandemic, a climate catastrophe, an earthquake, or economic and civil disruption, a large part of this is food security. When rebuilding the economy, is there sufficient hyper-local development, reskilling, and inclusiveness directives to focus on building resiliency as a keystone to help BC, and in particular the Capital Regional District, become a stronger and self-sufficient region? That's a very broad question. Is there any panelists would like to take a stab, or would everyone like to take a stab? Shall I read it out? Rob, thank you, Rob.
Yeah, this is going to touch on it indirectly, but I can speak to it from one angle. So I grew up in Ajax, Ontario, but most of my family's from Oshawa. A bunch of them worked in the auto plant, and I did my graduate studies down in Michigan, right? So if we think about resiliency, right, these are communities where it wasn't an environmental shock, but economic factors changed, the world globalized, and Oshawa the plant had 45,000 people working there in a city of over 100,000 and change. It was everything. And across southern Michigan, right, it was everything. And that industry basically disappeared in 20 years, right? It still persisted, but the plants went from having 40,000 people to having 1,000 people. And, it went very differently in those two places that have been my home before. Detroit is only just finally getting out of it. But Oshawa, things haven't been easy, but when I go back home and I see people, they're doing a lot better. And what do I think is really important for resiliency? It's that, the individual spirit matters, and it matters so much, and I don't want to underplay that, but it was their neighbors, right? It was the province being willing to step up and say, yeah, you contributed so much during good times, and now things are hard. And we're going to do something to make sure that you can get by and you can rebuild and you can have a place you're proud of, right? So in Oshawa, what did that mean? They had a community college, and the province, I think it was Mike Harris actually, he made the decision to turn that community college into a university, to drastically increase the spending, and it saved the downtown, right? And in Michigan, they didn't get that. And Detroit went bankrupt, and now we have a much slower rebuild. When these challenges hit region by region, right, making sure that as citizens and as voters, we have our neighbors' well-being as a priority. Let's us deal with it. This doesn't apply if the crisis hits us all at once, but if it hits us one by one, that's a really important lesson, I think.
Anyone else wish to? I mean, I will add, it's one of the things that I feel very reassured, coming back to the very first question of the panel discussion with respect to current government, is that they have recognized that, they're not going to follow the path that Alberta is following. Alberta seems to think that the recovery path from where we are now is to double down on oil and gas. That clearly is not going to be a successful way forward. I mean, it comes back to the adage that the definition of insanity is to consider doing more of the same thing and expect a different result. Whereas here we have already got a rather diversified economy, and the way forward is to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the climate change, for example, and position BC as a leader. So I'm quite excited by that, and I think this present government is, in collaboration, is doing a good job in that regard. I saw Emily put up her hand. Were you going to address this?
Just unmuting me.
And Maren as well after Emily, yeah.
Okay. Yes, I think just a few additional points. I think a big piece on the inclusive side is that we do make sure that we're looking at, I think technology, I hate to beat the drum all the time, the same drum, but the technology and the innovation side is something that, again, we could be doing a lot more. And those are sectors that actually have what we call, they make more first dollars, and that means that a dollar made there generates more spin-off, and that's why we tend to think of them as being quite important to the South Island economy. So I think when we're thinking about training and so on, it's and how to kind of protect that sort of hyper local, it's helpful to also think of our region as, if we put a moat around it and we're trying to keep as much dollars in, and we're trying to, you know, pull in as much dollars from outside and bring them in, and then circulate those dollars more within our economy. There's two sides to that. So one is we need the dollars into the economy, and so technology and those types of sectors, not just technology, but those types of sectors do a very good job at that. And then secondly, how do we then protect that hyper-local by ensuring that, you know, sort of how are we prioritizing by local, developing local supply chain is really critical. Obviously, food sovereignty is important for more than one reason, not just economic. It's something that's good for our communities, it's good for the climate, it's good for our health and all of these other things. So I think that those are sort of two ways to think about it. One is hyper-local in terms of how are we making sure that we understand that a local business, as opposed to a really large multinational company, local business is recirculating, I can't remember the numbers, but let's say it's 2 times at least, it's probably more, times the amount of dollars that get back and start recirculating into our economy. And so those are areas that we need to take care of, and developing those sort of interconnections and supporting how our local microeconomy works is important.
Thank you, Maren.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, as you said, I co-chair the BC Climate Solutions Council. So it's a diverse group of people from around the province, from industry, municipal mayors, industry, First Nations communities, academia, environmental groups, youth, et cetera, et cetera. Very diverse group of stakeholders. And in April, we met with the Premier and Minister James and Minister Heyman. And I just would like to, you know, support what Andrew's saying, which is they really did demonstrate a commitment to building back better. And we talked about, you know, shovel-worthy projects, not just shovel-ready projects. They asked us to give them advice. And so we have sent them in 3 rounds of advice. This last one, we had a piece in there about resilience, climate resilience, and, you know, investing, using some of this money to invest in climate resilience. So first off, we did look globally about what's happening, and places like Germany, who are really the gold standard in terms of how to put together stimulus in a progressive way that's going to also drive down emissions. They're putting about 1/3 of their stimulus towards green, clean initiatives. And so we've recommended that this government do the same, 500 million towards direct Clean BC type initiatives, electrification of vehicles, energy retrofits, and one of the buckets was around climate resilience. So I do think we need to use this stimulus to ensure that we're using some of it to invest in flood hazard mitigations, better farming techniques, so that we're actually using farming to use practices that are going to reduce GHGs, other climate resilience projects, building back wetlands, etc. But then I think, as the questioner said, I do agree that some of the other stimulus really does need to be targeted around other local food security, medical health security, supply chains, and ensuring that BC is investing in those things as well as training, which has been brought up. And I see there's a few questions about training, but really we do need to look at training for these sunrise industries and not keeping people going on perhaps shovel ready, but sunset industries like the oil and gas sector that we're seeing in Alberta.
Thank you, Maren. Just a quick sidebar before we move on. Dana Taylor provided an answer to the question that we posed earlier with respect to appliances such as clothes dryers have higher efficiency by removing a heating element and adding a more durable fan, which means it takes twice the time to dry your clothes. And that, he said, is from a appliance repair guide. So thank you, Dana, for helping us out with the answer to that. So there's lots of questions here. One to Colin. This one is with respect to something you said. It's from John. I happen to know this person. You said that providing housing for the homeless is a CRD priority. And his question or comment was, it's not clear to me what role the CRD can play in resolving the problem when individual municipalities are responsible for zoning and land use policy. Are you able to kind of expand upon that for us? Thank you.
Certainly, and I think I would offer that we are in the position of providing typically more of affordable housing than we are housing first, although we did just undertake a commitment in the last 4 years to pursue housing for those who are homeless as well, so the Regional Housing First program. Certainly what we do is we have to work as a region, and it almost sounds like a cliche, but it's true. The CRD, working with the province and the federal government through CMHC and BC Housing, in counter respective, we have to have jurisdictions that are willing to have that housing. And that has been something that has proved to be difficult because there are stigmas still with homeless. So it is fair to say to John that we are looking at more than just housing the homeless, but certainly we are, as an organization, saying with the Regional Housing First program, we are willing to house those who are the hardest to house. But within all of the housing we're also doing lower end rental and near market rental. And so the projects that we're building are based on leveraging that there is some near market in them to help subsidize those other units. So there is a role for the CRD to provide housing. It has unfortunately become more and more obvious as a result of the federal government devolving their responsibility, and nature abhors a vacuum. And so we have gotten involved. I don't apologize for that. I think we can do more. We have, as of right now, 1,500 units we manage. We have 47 buildings in the CRD that we manage. So we are already doing this. The first type of housing, though, where people need support to become sober, to become stable, to learn basic skills, that hasn't been something we've done on our own. And we have to partner with BC Housing, who provides the ability to connect us with health, so we can provide those wraparound services. But there is a role for us to play in local government.
Thank you, Colin. Building on that, there's a question from Ian Thieker here with respect to perhaps some of the investment of the $1.5 billion stimulus funding that BC has to play with. Play with is the wrong word, but to use moving forward. He asked about, what about raising the minimum wage so they raise people above poverty, particularly for essential frontline workers such as caregivers, service staff, cleaners, waste recyclers, etc. Would this require tax relief for small and medium businesses to avoid a surge in layoffs? ? So that's kind of a general question here as to what extent should the money that we get be used to actually supplement low-income earners. Perhaps one could view that in terms of a form of basic income, which we're sort of experimenting with on the fly now, or maybe I put it out to the panel for comment. Is there anyone who wishes to take a stab at that? I'm looking to the economist in the center. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So BC is already pushing ahead with the minimum wage increase. I think that is aggressive, but I think that it's important that they did it given that it was mapped out, right? There is when you agree to a schedule, right, there is value in sticking to it and providing consistency and, an indication that your word is your word. Now, you can certainly push it further, right? Because the path we're on is great, right? It's a huge improvement. It's going to have big impacts with respect to inequality. But we can do more. And probably the best way to do it is actually probably the federal government. Because the CRD, right, is a generous benefit, right? Like, it's so generous that I'm almost concerned about if you were unemployed at the wrong time, you're on a very different track, right? That is not as good. But it's great, right? It has very much stopped what is a depression-like decline from being even worse. And we can't just turn it off, right? If the feds turn off the CRD, we will have a rapid decline in the economy. So you want to find a way to smooth it, right? From having it to not having it. And you building out what is called the program, they changed the name, but it was called the Working Income Tax Benefit. I think it's called the Canada Workers Benefit now. Yep. It's a program where you get a subsidy as a low-income earner that goes up as you work a little bit and you make a little bit of money, and it flattens out and it's stable with respect to your earnings. And then as you earn more and more and more, it phases out. And right, that has the benefit of, right, it actually encourages work. And we only want to do that once COVID is kind of dealt with. But once we're there, right, it encourages work. It gets money to people who need it the most, right? A lot of those people who are on minimum wage, and right, it does so economically efficiently. And we have a model that is already built. So I would strongly urge the federal government to do it. And there's certainly nothing that would stop the province from using some of that money to build that type of system.
Well, this leads to a question from Susan. There's a couple of questions on training that was alluded to. I'd like to get to those next after this one, but Susan says here that she agrees that we need to stimulate the economy and help those who need it. However, we need to be very careful that we don't put too much more pressure on our younger generation as we give out money. Is there a firm plan on how governments plan to recover those costs? So the question is, what about debt? I don't know whether anyone is able to address this. Are we burdening future generations with debt as for a short-term fix? Emily has put her hand up. Over to you.
I don't know if I should do this over the economist in the room, but it's actually topical because I had this conversation with my husband, who's an economist. Today we were sort of debating this on our lunch walk, and not really much of a debate, really. But I think the general consensus is that you have absolutely no choice but to do stimulus. So you even hear these very conservative neoclassical kind of economists sort of say, no, you absolutely have no other alternative to not have a sort of depression on your hands. So it's required to do that. However, what's interesting is the debate now is sort of like how long and then at what cost. So at what point does this create an inflation situation where we're basically just pushing off the pain to later, and we're going to hit the pain later. So I think that's always the balance, and we're doing this. This is very unprecedented. We actually don't know. This is like a science project. I think economists everywhere are biting their nails. They have no idea what's going to happen. We've never done this before. There's never been this degree and amount of stimulus flowing into the whole world like there is right now. And some of the issue is, if for sure that could have negative impacts, and it likely will definitely cause inflation. I can't imagine how it wouldn't. We also don't know how much more stimulus is going to be required if we face a second wave. But the other sort of added challenge of not doing it is what we just saw Sweden do. And Sweden tried to say, you know what, we're going to take the pain on at the front end. We're not going to actually print as much money as the other countries are doing. We're going to try to weather this and get through it. And what happened was they just sort of doubled down on their pain because they were less competitive compared to all the other countries that were actually just dumping new printed money into the economy to be able to pay for this debt. So, I mean, of course, that's the issue. The only way that we're able to take on this debt is because central banks are printing money. So it's a difficult one. I think the only thing to say is, like any good Canadian, we got to keep people afloat during these times. There's no question of that. And then we'll have to see what sort of situation we're in and what kind of measures we need to take in the coming years to avoid other future, possibly catastrophic problems caused by loss of inflation. Well, Rob, please correct me now for everything if I got it wrong.
Before we go to Rob, I'd like to ask, there was a question from Sarah Fowler, who, while I've got you on the speaker there, Emily, she asked, does the Prosperity Partnership only include Victoria or also north of Victoria and the Gulf Islands?
Okay, good, excellent question. I'm sorry I didn't list out all them off at the beginning of this. We are actually representing 11 of the 13 municipalities that make up the region. So Greater Victoria or South Island. So that includes all the Saanaches, like Councillor Plant there, CRD chair. He's from Saanich, of course, and so basically everyone except for Langford and Metchosin are members. The Gulf Islands, we support them, and we're exploring sort of a membership, some sort of reciprocity there. But and also all nine First Nation communities as well are also part of the partnership.
Thank you, Rob. You were going to comment on the debt issue.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that was said, right? You are hard pressed to find an economist right now, regardless of their worldview, who is not saying, as soon as the virus is contained, spend. And while the virus is live, make sure you keep people afloat. On debt, like just definitionally, right? Yeah, we are going to settle, people with debt, but that's right why we have government, right? We can change the timing of our spending. As citizens, right? What is our choice? Well, yeah, we want to spend now. We want to run up debt. If we're really worried about our kids, what should we do as soon as we're out of this crisis? We should go raise some money and we should pay it down. And there is a history of doing that. I'm maybe a little bit more nervous federally than provincially, right? Because we were running not non-trivial deficits federally for kind of the sake of running deficits. That's fine. It was not a threat to the economy, but right, it was starting to add up. And as a result, now that we're probably going to have a $300 million deficit federally, we're actually starting to get to debt levels that are starting to look like the Chrétien-Martin era. And then we do need to take it a little bit seriously. So I certainly hope that the federal government, does tackle that, because the next generation is going to have enough problems. So let's pay it off, at least to some extent, ourselves. Provincially, we are in amazing shape. We have so much fiscal space. If anything, my advice to the government would be, you can do a lot more than $1.5 billion. And certainly, that's looking at one fiscal year. This is going to be a multi-fiscal year plan. So I suspect that they'll change that.
Thank you. I'd like to move to the questions on learning and education. There's two here that I'd like to address first. This is from Troy. He says the following: the COVID-19 crisis has forced remote learning upon our school system. While it cannot equal in-person learning for general education, teachers have long bemoaned, with good reason, the loss of knowledge students experience over the 2-month summer holiday. Has any thought been put into investing in the distance learning model as a way for students to stay engaged on a part-time basis over the summer holiday to mitigate this problem? This could be an opportunity to find a compromise between year-round schooling and families that want a summer break. This is something that I would like to go to Colin, if you could, because Colin is our resident teacher. I mean, well, Katja and Rob and I are at university, of course, but Colin is in the K-12 system. Colin, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm happy to offer a little bit of an insight, and certainly the reason why we had summers off, we know historically was for agricultural purposes, and yet it's been now ensconced in collective agreements that the school year is 10 months. I think around the province, the decision to offer year-round schooling has been devolved to individual school boards to explore that, and that is something that is certainly probably going to be front of mind as we come out of this. I know in the 4 school districts here in the Capital Regional District, Gulf Islands all the way down through Soup District, I have not heard that as the case yet. I think everybody is still just trying to get through this 4-week period, feels like 4 months, of trying to offer education online. But I will say this, while it works for some, I have found the experience to be less than satisfying at the high school level. And it is just not a replacement. It is certainly a way to continue, as the question was posed, yes. But over the summer, the collective agreement would have had to be reviewed earlier in all of the districts that we're talking about here in the Capital Regional District, and that hasn't been broached yet, as far as I'm aware. So it won't be happening this summer, but I think everything is going to be on the table as we move forward. Although, of course, you would recognize as a provincial MLA, the BCTF and the provincial government have just signed a 3-year deal. And right. I don't think there was any provision for doing such in the collective agreement unless a district chose to. Thank you.
Maybe, I don't know whether Rob or Katja have any comments with respect from the perspective of Zoom University. Both of you are teaching at Zoom at UVic, and UVic in the fall will have all its courses done through, pretty much all its courses through distance learning. Do you have any comments on this, Katja? I see you've got your
I'm currently teaching 2 courses online, and it's an interesting experience. That being said, in the school where I teach, most courses are already online, so I think we are well prepared to teach online. But at the same time, we are going through all the same challenges that everyone else is experiencing. So, for example, we are currently changing our learning system from the system that we used to have for years to a new system. So it's a learning experience for everyone, and everyone is trying to stay adaptive and resilient.
There's another question from an anonymous attendee. It says, skills training are often offered as a solution for economic dislocations. However, workers are mostly not keen on retraining, possibly because of negative past experiences. They just want a job now. Also, many, particularly in rural Indigenous communities, are tired of constant training that doesn't lead to an actual job. How can these challenges be addressed, particularly in the short term? And this is in relation to COVID-19. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? It's a very good question. Oh, thank you, Emily. I'm glad you came to the rescue, my rescue here.
No, I think that's a really, really excellent point.
It is.
Yeah, my personal belief is that we need to do a much better job at you know, as society collectively. I'm not pointing a finger anywhere, but we need to do a better job at understanding the needs of the labor force and then connecting that to more flexible, adaptable education opportunities that are not necessarily degrees and formal things like that, but opportunities to do upskilling and reskilling. And I read an interesting book a few years ago about, it was much more futuristic, sort of in like a decade from now, we might need to look at the frequency with which we'll have to retrain ourselves and upskill to be able to meet the changing demands of our own work. Will require some really innovative thinking about even having a skills mortgage as opposed to a house mortgage, because it's this idea that how are we possibly going to be able, we can't leave more people behind as their jobs become, you know, obsolete very quickly. And so I think that's just food for thought for all of us to think, wow, this is the world that we might be moving into. So having said that, there are ways that we can do more to make sure that the changing training requirements are meeting the labor force requirements better. And that's from basic, sort of some of it's basic collaboration, but I've also heard people experimenting with ideas like you could be looking at LinkedIn all the time, pulling anything, any sort of job description that's being posted or recruited for, or new title positions. You'd start to be able to feed this information back to a sort of what are the new skills in demand. So that kind of innovative way of thinking, I think, will be important going forward when we know that now, you know, the younger generation, they're only doing all of their job research. It's all online. There's no other ways anymore to do it. So that's one piece. And I think the second piece is that flexibility. We're going to see more need for collaborative sort of menu-based education opportunities. We're seeing ideas, you know, different pockets of places look at that. We have a skills, an education and skills development committee that are working at some of these really interesting, I think, and innovative ideas about how to address the labor force needs in a way that is responsive and adaptable and also collaborative with other institutions. So I think that's very promising. I'm excited to see those ideas become fleshed out. I think that they would be great for great candidates for stimulus funding.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions. Oh, Maren, sorry, I missed you.
That's okay. I just put my hand up. I just wanted to add that the government, you know, when they released Clean BC, which is the climate plan for BC, but it's also integrated with the energy and the economic strategy. As Andrew well knows, he was one of the lead people behind getting that released. They then started on a labor readiness report and looking at, okay, if we move ahead with this transition of our economy, what are the skills? Just like Emily is saying, what are the skills that we're going to need? Now, the only unfortunate thing, it was brilliant to have done it. They haven't completed it or released it. But I think that kind of report, and I've been encouraging them, and I'm saying this as I encourage all of you to encourage the government to complete and release that report, because you could then pair that with the skills training, and doing it right now in this time would be the perfect time. You know, so for instance, I think Katja, you were talking about this little thing on your EV and trying to get the charger fixed, and there just wasn't the skills. I mean, so if we are transitioning, you know, by 2040, we're saying we're going to have 100% of all car sales are going to be electric vehicles. How many electricians and EV mechanics are we going to need? And then let's get that all lined up and start training people now. So, and
that's a message I will take home as the MLA for the riding, to ensure that that message gets delivered directly, because I think it's a very good message today. But thank you, Maren. Yeah. Katja.
Just a very quick note to say that in my school, my colleague, Dr. Tamara Kravchenko, is currently doing research on this topic, studying this exact issues of just transition, how to retrain people, create new jobs when moving to post-COVID recovery and to low carbon future.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here in the area of agriculture. I thought I'd lump them together. Murray says here that temporary foreign workers are not able to fill agricultural positions for the current year. Is there, basically asking what to do? Is there some kind of provincial money that should be put in that regard to assist with the agriculture? And further on down here, we had a question with respect to, where was it? I'll find, there's so many questions here. Well, let's deal with that one first, with the temporary foreign workers. It is an issue. I don't know to the extent in Saanich, maybe Colin knows whether Saanich farmers employ, or on the peninsula, many temporary foreign workers or not. Certainly it's a big issue in the Delta and Fraser Valley regions of British Columbia. If it is an issue, it's not an issue for Oak Bay, Gordon Head, there is but one piece of ALR in our riding, and that's not serviced by temporary foreign workers. So perhaps Colin could comment on this from...
Yeah, I don't have a lot to offer on it. I do know that there are farmers and there are landscape businesses that import temporary foreign workers, or not import, invite to come and work in Canada, and there have been challenges with COVID. But I do think this does speak to perhaps even the earlier discussion about the wages. We have a problem with people not wanting to do this work. I can't help but think there is an amazing paradox going on. We have lots of people on the CERB right now, and yet we also have people who don't want to go work on farms. So I apologize if I've kind of touched on a touchy issue, but we have a population that doesn't value this type of work. And so that's something I'll just have to chew on. But
well,
as far as your question...
I hear you there, Colin, and I'll tell you why I hear you, is that the summer job for kids out of high school when I was growing up was we picked tulips up on Saanich Peninsula. I don't think that's the job for the people aspire to do in their summer holidays now. Picking tulips, not tulips, daffodils. Sorry, it was daffodil pickers.
There is certainly qualified and trained labor that temporary foreign workers can bring if they've done a job for year and year and year. But if you're talking about just having pickers to pick strawberries, I know, for example, Gailey Farms are leaving product on the field because they don't have people. And so I guess the question is, what can we do about this? Yeah. I do think we have to have a discussion about work being honorable and paying that work to lead to the honor that's attached to it. And maybe it's the degrading nature of certain type of work that people still have issues with. But I see this as the fact that we have to import temporary foreign workers, I actually find sad for this country. That's a personal opinion, not the CRD board's position.
Yeah, Rob was going to add to this.
Yeah, so I'm going to largely agree, but have a bit of a pivot. The TFW program is, in a sense, an outlet to our labor markets, right? If we imagine the TFW program disappeared, how does agriculture look? We probably have a little bit less, right? That is probably an outcome. Wages are probably a lot higher, and it's all done with domestic workers, right? So the TFW program fundamentally exists to get labor from elsewhere, and it keeps wages down, and it makes those farms more profitable, and that is not an easy industry, right? So that's the rationale. So now we're in a world where TFWs are to some degree limited, and so, right, the market is going to function a little bit better. So if there's a labor shortage, we know the answer. Yeah, you up wages, but it's a difficult time. So where is the solution? It probably is, firms will probably get a small part of it, and then hopefully the CRD transforms into a wage subsidy such that, right, farms can then hire domestic workers. There is a bit of a skills tension, right, because a lot of agricultural work is skilled rather than unskilled, but that's something that we can train, and maybe you just have different ratios of workers. But yeah, it's a huge problem, and to be honest, I think we've been building to this point in our labor institutions for a long time. I'm certainly a believer that if you're going to come here to work as a TFW, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to stay. And the only reason I think that doesn't happen is because that would create upwards pressure on wages.
Thank you. There's three final questions. Oh, Emily, sorry.
Thank you. I think I agree generally. I think I would just add that we have an agriculture, food and beverage committee, and I know they've engaged in this topic more deeply, but it is very, very difficult to fill the roles with local workers, and for a variety of reasons. And that's sort of a classic story across the country and a lot of the sort of developed world. Same thing. So that's systemic. In terms of wage increases and so on, I mean, that might be actually just like the natural place for that to go. However, that will kill also. I mean, the predominant, the sector that, you know, the small producers, sorry, are the ones that are operating on the thinnest of margins, and they're honestly largely like labors of love in most cases, and very important, I think, for reasons beyond just sort of regular supply and demand. That they're just they should be part of our communities. So I think it's a more complex issue that does require government support, because they simply, especially a lot of these farmers they're highly regulated. They're working on farms, you know, where they have their hands tied in a lot of ways. And so what you see, you know, movements in Europe, for example, where people work more towards cooperative movements, because again, they cannot do that value add or the distribution or the marketing and all of these other things. So to me, that's a good place to add government subsidies and so on. It's that general place where you're adding capacity across the sector by investing in sort of things that that sector can use collectively, that adds value to their product. I think that's a different way to sort of look at how to keep their costs more affordable and keep them more, you know, viable. Actually, what we're talking about is viability of those businesses.
Thank you. So the final question, there's a number of questions here, and I do apologize for us not getting to them. A number have been addressed by Colin earlier with respect to the arts and culture, a very important component of our economy locally, and in Vancouver, as well as other parts of British Columbia. Colin touched upon those earlier in his answer, but the last question will go to Laurie, who says this, and it's something that I know I've been mentioning to government. I know that some of the reports by our former Innovation Commissioner in the Emerging Economy Task Force allude to this as well, and Emily's discussed it briefly. Laurie's question is this: Canada's gross domestic expenditure on research and development is lower than many other countries, and BC is even lower. What do you think is the amount? It's different. I don't want to put you on the spot with a dollar amount, but what do you think about the importance, or she says, what do you think is the amount BC should be spending in R&D to be a leader in innovation, especially green and medical and biomedical R&D? Does anyone have comments on that? For me, that, you know, I resonate with that comment, because this is something that I've been working on with government. The Innovation Commission was part of our platform when I was leader of the BC Greens, as was the Emerging Economy Task Force. Reports have been released. Government has committed to work to move forward, putting innovation as a foundational cornerstone of some of the investment of the $1.5 billion. But I'm wondering if any of the panelists have any ideas as to how much, what, when, and where. And I suspect Emily will, and Maren will as well, if other panelists do as well. Anyone want to start? Emily.
I will. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually very broad. You know, it takes over quite a lot of different aspects, different ways you could tackle that question, I suppose. In terms of increasing our R&D generally, it's sort of different ways to measure that as well. A lot of people look at sort of patents and other things. So there's different ways to think about innovation and R&D and how, you know, how innovative our economy is. I think I'm not going to go with the number, the figure, or suggest a figure, but what I would say is typically we actually Canadians do R&D quite well. What we do very not so well, to be generous, but I don't want to say what we do badly, but commercialization is where we do not compete very well compared to other OECD countries. So that aspect of how do we, you know, we very proudly say we're a country of, you know, small businesses, and that's true. We're predominantly, most of our labor market comes from very small businesses. We have to also start thinking, well, that's not necessarily something to completely boast about. Why can our businesses why do they stop growing? And so that is something that we need to look at in terms of how does our country grow sustainably, our economy. So R&D is a major factor of it, and I would say actually our post-secondary institutions do extraordinarily well. They're very innovative. They come up with lots and lots of IP. The part where we have a major gap, disconnect, is how do we then build that sort of stream to get those ideas commercialized and turned into viable businesses? And then part two, how do we then take those companies and then really figure out why are they not scaling? Why are they not growing? Why do they always sort of get to a certain size and either just stay there, or they're sold and they're usually acquired by a foreign company, a lot of American companies. So how do we kind of keep that, our competitive advantage, our intellectual property, how do we actually keep that at home and derive sustainable financial profits and jobs and so on for everybody? How do we do that better?
Thank you, Maren.
I don't have the answer. Yeah.
So just to be super brief here, but to add to what Emily said, she's outlined some of the great things and the challenges for Canada and BC. One of the key things that governments do in other countries is they buy things. So, to give you an example, there's Corvus Energy in Richmond that's making electric batteries for ferries. We just started to buy them. We've got Ballard fuel cells, but Norway's been buying them for years and electrifying their ferries. We've got Ballard, who's making, hydrogen fuel cell buses. Do they sell any in BC? Zero. They're a global leader in electric bus manufacturing or hydrogen fuel cell manufacturing. I could go on and on. So we need to be actually purchasing these clean technologies. Just to stay on the electric bus one, we have some of the world's leading electric bus companies in Canada, and we buy almost none. So that's part of how you actually commercialize the technologies, and you help those companies once they are selling at scale in their own country. That sends a signal to other countries that this is good technology. Their country's buying it. It must be good. We're going to buy it as well. So there's tons of opportunity for growth there. As Emily said, we do really well in this space. There's a organization out of San Francisco that every year names the top 100 clean tech companies. Generally, Canada gets 10 to 12 of those top 100, so we do pretty well. And generally, half of those come from British Columbia. So we are a small province, and we get half of Canada's clean tech recognition in the Clean Tech 100. So just to let us all know, we're actually doing pretty good, but I agree we could do a lot better by buying stuff here and creating some kind of innovation fund that's really going to spur this. And I think that's one of the opportunities out of this stimulus and recovery discussion that we're having.
Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, I agree with the comments already made. I have two small additions. One, our main tax policy tool in this area, the SHRED tax credit, is a bit of a train wreck, unfortunately. It's pretty universally panned as mainly just funding existing activity rather than incremental activity. We need to go back to the drawing board on that one. Whether it's a different tax credit or whether it is just funding core research, it hasn't delivered results. So that's one where we need to give it another shot. And then a totally different bent. There's some fascinating research by a friend at Michigan State who did work actually on the impact of, in the US context, lynchings on innovation activity and patents. And what was the thought? It was, right, if you have a subset of the population, right, that is being brutalized, that is separated, right, that is not an integrated part and is not welcome, that's an innovation potential that you are leaving on the table. And right, do we have a one-for-one comparison to that? We definitely don't. But do we have racism in Canada? Do we have communities that don't have the same opportunities as other ones? Yeah, right? So in terms of generalizable results, I actually think that is a really outside the box way that we can look at this problem.
Interesting. Thank you. I wanted to just add on my own bit on that is one of the things that I've been discussing with government for quite some time, and I brought this from my recognition as a former university, well, I am a university prof, but former researcher at the University of Victoria. BC has not been very good at leveraging federal money for R&D in our province by matching existing federal programs. Other jurisdictions like Ontario and Quebec have been much more efficient at that. One of the things I've been pushing for, and there's a reception, is to try to create said innovation fund that Maren meant, a fund that allows, in a relatively timely fashion, without duplicating the administrative structure, matching of some federal programs. We do have BC KDF as one example, but that really is infrastructure program. It's not so much the R&D funding. And so there is an opportunity there, and lots of good ideas have been put forward, I think, in that area. With that, I want to thank all of the panelists and in particular the participants. It's been really invigorating. We've recorded it, we'll put it on Facebook, so if you haven't had a chance to see it now, we'll make it available so people can go afterwards and look at this panel discussion. Thank you, Katja, very much. I know you're teaching 2 courses, and these are heavy courses in the spring session. Emily, thank you so much. Maren, thank you for joining us, and Colin, you too. And of course, Rob, thank you again. And thank you to all the participants. And in particular, finally, thank you, Noah, whose name you see at the bottom there, for the technical setup of our event. Thank you, Noah, very much, and everyone for joining us. We'll hopefully have another town hall in the near future. Thanks again. Bye-bye.